Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is the next video in the additional skill RPA developer series, and the topic which we have chosen is the databases. Prior to this video in the series, we have already seen how you can install the SQL Server, what are the basics of databases, how do you create, insert, retrieve and data into the tables. We have also seen the clauses and the operators, and now in the same series we are exploring something which is called constraints. We have already explained a lot of constraints in this series, and this video is going to be the continuation of the constraints. In case you are not aware of any of this and you do not have the SQL Server, you can watch this playlist and get the SQL Server installed on your computer. All the links, everything is available in the description for your reference. Before directly jumping to the agenda, in case you are coming to the channel for the first time and you haven't already subscribed, please consider subscribing to the channel to get the latest updates. Talking of the agenda, we are going to quickly start with what exactly are the constraints. We are going to have a quick recap that what we have already covered in the previous videos. Today we are going to see a new constraint which is not already covered, which is the not null constraint. How do you add it to the table? How do you add it to the existing table? How do you remove it? And all of this we are going to see with the help of step-by-step demonstration, right? Talking of what exactly is the constraint, so whenever we are working on the databases and I have a set of data which is available in the table. Now I want to enforce some kind of rules, I want to ensure some kind of conditions in the data. Then why do I want to do that? So that my data is accurate, consistent and reliable. So whenever we think of applying some rules, some condition to the data which is already in the table or the data which is going to be inserted into the table, we have to use something which is called the constraints. Talking of the constraint, these are the most common constraints which are covered on the screen: primary, foreign, unique, check, default and not null, right? All of this we have already covered. The last one we are going to cover today. So those of you looking for the first time, you need to have a background of all of that to understand the today's video, right? When we talk about the primary key, for example, I am creating a table and I want to make sure that the employee ID should be unique for every employee. I am going to use something which is called primary key, right? The second one we have seen was the foreign key, when we want to have a relationship between the two tables. Take an example, I have an employee table and I have a department table. Now, in a company, an employee should have a department. If he do not have a department, that means that he is nowhere associated with the company. So if you have to maintain such relationship where you have one table and you want to establish a relationship with a different table, then you use something which is called the foreign key, right? The third one we have already explored is called the unique key, where you want to make sure that apart from the primary key, you want to have unique key, which means that two columns value should be always unique. Take an example of the again employee table. So in a company, if there is employees, all the employees should have a different email ID. If two employees have the same email ID, it creates a confusion. So if we have to create such kind of structure, we use the unique key, right? The next one was the check constraint, which actually enforce the data integrity even before you insert the data into the table, right? We have seen that, let's say I want to have a database where I want to check the age and I want to insert the data only if the age is greater than 18. So such kind of constraint can be applied with the help of check constraint. In the last video, we have seen something which is called the default constraint, which simply means that how you can put a default value to the columns when you are inserting. Take an example again of the employee table, right? Whenever I am adding an employee to the database, I want to make him active. So the value of is active is set to 1. That means it's a default constraint. In case you are not aware of any of these, please watch the previous videos to understand what exactly all these constraints do and how do you work with them in the SSMS. We are going to discuss something which is called a not null constraint. Now, what exactly is this constraint when we say not null, right? So not null constraint is used to specify in a particular column that it cannot be left empty or it cannot have a null value. Okay, so for example, I am creating a table, and in that table there are some columns which cannot be null or which cannot be empty. I want to make sure that that column at least have the value. I can always have a constraint which is called a not null constraint. The not null constraint ensures the data integrity by ensuring the presence of the value. Now what is the benefit? It prevents the insertion of incomplete or the invalid data, which help you to maintain the consistency and the reliability of the data, right? So in simple words, if I am creating a table and I want to make sure that the column should have value, I am going to use something which is called the not null constraint. How does this thing work? Let's quickly go to SSMS and see that in action. I am into my SQL server, and this is the same database where we have been working, the UiPath database. I hope all of you have the database now. Now let's try to create a table called employees. So I have copy pasted a syntax, create table employees, that create a table employee. Employee ID should be a primary key that we have already discussed. Now I want to have a column which is called name. It is a varchar column, and I have specified something which is called not null. Now this not null indicates that the name cannot be blank in a employee table, and that makes sense, right? Because if I have an employee, he should have a name. The email ID again is a varchar, but this is null, right? That means that email ID can be null, right? But again, if you think ideally, this should be also not null, right? So to differentiate between them, I have made this to not null, and this is again is null, right? And employee ID is a primary key. So the first thing first, how do you add a not null constraint? When you are creating the table, you just have to add this keyword which is called not null in front of the column which you want to make sure does not have null values. Okay, now once I go and create this table, the command is completed and the table is created. Okay, now the name is not null. Now what we are going to do next is, let's try to insert some record here. Okay, I have got this insert statement where I am saying that insert into the employees. I am passing the employee ID and I am passing the email ID, right? So we had the next name as well, but which is not null, but here I am not passing the name. If I go here and I say execute, you would notice that cannot insert the value null into the column name. It says that, hey Mukesh, your table has a column which is called the name column. It is a not null constraint and you are not providing me the value. So I cannot insert the value into the table, right? Now one thing which you can use is the default constraint, right? You can provide a default value to the name column that we have already seen, right? So I hope you now are getting it. What happens if I simply provide the name? So this was the first statement. Let me just copy paste a second statement here. Now the first one, this got failed because we do not have the value for the name. This is the second statement where I have the employee ID, I have the name, and I have the email. This was a not null, so I am providing the name as John Doe. I go here and I say execute, and this was success. Okay, so let's quickly validate. To validate, how do we validate? We simply use a statement called select star from, and we use the table name which is employees. Execute, and you can see that the employee is inserted successfully. Okay, now one thing here, I'll copy this and I'll paste it here. So this third statement, this one, right? So insert into employee, employee ID is the primary key, so cannot be null. Employee name is here, but email, when we are creating the table, we have specified it that we have not given any constraint. So even if I remove this email from here, okay, and I delete this here, right? So now I am inserting only the employee ID because that's a primary key, and the name, because if I don't insert the name, it won't allow. but I'm not providing the email ID. Would it work? Let's see. I'll go here and I say execute, and it says that violation of the primary key because you cannot insert duplicate, right? 1 is already for John Doe, so I can make it to 2. Execute, 1 row affected, go here and execute. Now if you see your structure, right, your email ID column is null for the second record, and which is ideally not correct. So if I have a database and I have a table which is having null columns, blank column, how are you going to apply the query? How are you going to send an email, let's say, to all these people, right? So that is why it is important to have the not null constraint. The not null constraint allows you to have a condition that nobody can insert a null value into the table, right? So these were the queries which we have just executed. Create table employees, this was the table. When I tried to execute with this one, it failed because of not null, but when we provided all the values, it actually worked. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. If you understood the not null constraint, please comment the not null so that I know that yes, you guys understood the constraint. Okay, now let's move forward, right? See this example. I have already created a table, and later on I realized that okay, my table has to be added a constraint which I forgot while creating the table. So same like the previous constraint, if you forgot to add it while creating the table, you can always add it once the table is created also. All you have to do is just you have to use this syntax which is called alter table name, whatever table you have. For us it's employees, alter table employees, alter column, what is the column name, right? For us the column name is name, set to not null, right? So if you see here, when I was doing this, right, I did not provided the email ID, right? So that means my email ID was not null. Now let's try to do something. Let's make our email ID column to not null and then try to insert null. So we will understand this concept as well, right? But the thing to remember here is the syntax. Alter table name, then you have to again mention alter, which is the column, and then you have to use the keyword which is called set, and what is the constraint. Okay, let's see that in action in the SQL Server. Okay, so I am back into the SQL Server. When I created the table, I did not mention this guy as the not null constraint. Now we want to alter the table. So what is the statement? It's absolutely simple. We have to mention alter table, then the table name, employees. Okay, then what do you want to do? I want to add a constraint to the column, so we have to alter the column as well. Which is the column? The column name is email, like this. Okay, and now we want to set a constraint which is called not null. So we want to set a constraint which is not null. Okay, so if I go here and try to execute this, so I am getting an error which says that your syntax is not proper, right? So again, right, so that means that my set keyword is not working with SSMS, right? So that means that I have made some syntax error, right? Let me quickly see the other syntax, right? Alter table employees, alter the column, this set is not working. So what I can do is I'll simply say that instead of set, I'll just pass this complete thing. Okay, now here what I am doing, alter table employees, alter column email, pass the complete syntax of the table which you created, right? So we had the email varchar 100, right? So sometimes the set might work with the other databases. If set is not working, what you can do is you can simply use this one, email varchar 100, and set it to not null. Now let's try to execute. It is saying me that you are trying to update the employee table and you are trying to set the email as not null. However, if you see this one, it says that you already have some data into the employee table which is null. That's why I cannot apply this constraint. right? What does this mean? This is important, right? Just focus here. If you see here in the table, I have this column for the second record, which is null, right, which we just inserted. And now I am telling SQL Server to apply a not null constraint to this complete column. But what about the existing value? What will SQL do with this one? So it is telling me that, Mukesh, I cannot add the constraint not null because you already have data which is null. So before you apply any constraint to the existing data, you need to make sure that data in the existing table comply. So let's do one thing. I'll go here and I'll simply say delete this record. Okay. So I'll say you can insert the email ID as well. That's again depending on you. So I'll just quickly go here and I say delete from employees, and I'll say where employee ID is equal to 2. I'll execute this. Now my table do not have any null records. Now let's go and try to alter the table. This was our statement: alter table employees, alter the column and set it to not null. Previously when I was doing it, I got an error, but now let's try to execute, and now my not null constraint is added to the email as well. Okay, now let's see that in action. Previously when I inserted this employee ID and name, right, I given the employee ID as 2 and the name as John, right? So let me change it to Jane for this demo now. Okay, now previously when I inserted this was successful because the email ID we were not passing here, but now we have altered the table and we have made the email ID also as not null. So if I try to execute this, it says that I cannot insert. That means that our alter was successful. If I simply go here and I pass the email ID, which is, let's say, jane@abc.com, right, and I hit a comma here and I say email, now this insert should be successful, right? Now what we have done is, previously this was not null, so we were able to insert null, but now since we have altered the table and added the constraint, we are not able to insert the null, right? So that's how you have to work with the not null constraint. Coming back to my presentation, right, so we have seen that the set was not working. In case the set does not work, you just put the alter column and whatever the complete data type you have, we just put it and it should work. Okay, now after executing the statement, whatever we have mentioned here, the name column was set to not null. For our case, it was employee. Now this is the thing we have just seen, right? It is important to note that when you are adding a not null to the existing table, there is a potential risk that the existing rows with not null constraint you want to modify, right? Because SQL did not allow me to do so. So what I had to do is I had to delete the record. Other thing could be that you need to explicitly specify the value, right? But the idea is that you have to make sure that your data is compliant. If your data is not compliant, you cannot alter the existing table. That is why it is always recommended that you always think of the constraint at the beginning before your table is blank. Once the data is there, it's difficult to manage the constraint. Okay, so moving ahead, in case I want to remove the not null constraint, you simply have to use the alter statement and you can use the drop here to drop the constraint. Now there are some things which you need to keep in mind when you are dropping a constraint. Let's say when I am removing the not null constraint, it will not automatically populate the null values, right? Whether you are adding or whether you are removing, you need to make sure that the data should be compliant before you add or remove any constraint. It is worth noting that removing a not null constraint should be done with caution. Ensure that it aligns with your data requirements, right? And as soon as you remove the null constraint, you expose your data to data integrity issues and inconsistency on your databases. So let's say you have a name column in your database and you just remove the constraint. Right now what would happen when the new records are coming, if there is not null or there is a null in the name, your data will just accommodate, right? That will cause you inconsistency, your data integrity issues, and you might get into other problems as well, right? So please be cautious whenever you are removing the not null constraints. So that is all I wanted to cover for the not null constraint. Let's have a quick recap. So we have seen that what exactly are the constraints. There are various different kinds of constraints which are available. The last we have seen today is the not null, which is simply used to specify in a particular column that it should have a value and it cannot be left empty, right? It ensures that every row in the table has a valid value. The not null ensures the data integrity. It also prevents you from inserting incomplete data into the table, right? And lastly, we have seen that we can always add or remove the not null constraints. Okay, so with that, I would like to wrap this video here. In case if you have any more questions, any more doubts, feel free to write me in the comments, or you can also drop me an email as well. So thank you for watching. If you like this video, please do subscribe to the channel, and happy automation.